Hi everyone, thanks again for clicking on this video. Today I'm going to talk about sort of the second half of the history of Palestine and Israel and get almost to where we are today. I'll pick up today in 1949, right after the establishment of the State of Israel. If you haven't yet, if you're interested, you can still go back and look at the first half, the other set of slides that cover the history from about 1880 until 1948. So as always, we come back to maps, and here we can see the state of affairs in 1949. So as I talked about in the last set of slides, there is a war that is fought from 1947 to 1949. It has two phases. First, it is the Zionist forces against the Palestinian majority population of the territory. They are defeated. And then it's the Zionist forces against many of the neighboring countries. The Zionists defeat those forces as well. And as the conflict ends, there are a series of armistice agreements that are signed. To this day, except for several exceptions that I'll talk about a little bit later, there are no full or permanent peace treaties between Israel and most of its neighbors. And so the armistice lines have effectively served as borders, and they've shifted over time. And you can see here, this is where we were in 1949. Just to sort of reiterate, in white in the center are the territories that become the new state of Israel. You can see the surrounding countries in gray. And then you have what we call the occupied Palestinian territories, Gaza and the West Bank, and East Jerusalem as well. After 1948, Egypt takes control of Gaza, and Jordan takes control of and, in fact, annexes the West Bank. So Israel is established in 1948 in those borders that you just saw. And from the very beginning, it is a country that is set up in a discriminatory manner, in a racist manner. As I talked about in the previous set of slides, Israel comes to be a country through a project of settler colonialism. A group of people, Jewish nationalists, Zionists, primarily from Europe, come together and decide they're going to settle this other territory in a different part of the world. And they do so with the explicit intention that this will be a country, a homeland for one group of people, for Jews, and not for the other groups of people who live in that territory. And so from the very beginning of that movement, one of the primary goals was to create a demographic majority, to change the demographics of what was Palestine and then comes to be called Israel from majority Palestinian Arab to majority Jewish. And finally, then, in the war in 1947-49, the Zionists are able to achieve this goal. And they do so primarily through ethnic cleansing. And so the Zionist forces, the militias, the terror cells instill fear in the Palestinian population, cause them to flee. In some cases, they massacre them. And in other cases, they force them out at the point of a rifle. And so the majority of Palestinians who lived in what becomes Israel in 1948 are kicked out of their homes, and they are prevented from ever returning for the most part. However, the Zionists were not successful in getting rid of every single Palestinian who lived in these territories. Some of them remained, and they are, for about 20 years, under military rule, and they eventually, some of them, become citizens of Israel. And so this becomes a minority population in Israel. But what happens, again, from the very beginning, because of this ideology that says this is a country for the Jewish population, it belongs to one group of people and not fully to any other group. And so the new government of the State of Israel sets about creating a number of discriminatory laws, all aimed either explicitly or implicitly at maintaining Jewish dominance and Palestinian subjugation. And if you're interested in more details about this book, Stateless Citizenship, is quite good on this topic, has a lot of information about the ways in which the new state of Israel and into the present has created a situation where the laws are written in such a way that they benefit, that they keep dominant the Jewish population and subjugate the Palestinian minority population. Several of the ways, particularly at the beginning, that Israel does this is they use laws to expropriate further Palestinian land, and indeed this continues into the present. taking more land from people that had belonged to Palestinians, either then using it, giving it to new Jewish immigrants, or taking it for the control of the use by the state. And in many cases as well, violence is used to maintain this structure and this system. And so, as I said, most of the Palestinians who had lived in this territory are kicked out of their homes. And many of them go to neighboring countries. They go to Jordan, they go to Gaza, and elsewhere. And so they are close enough in some cases that they can, if they're able, cross back over this new border and attempt to return to their homes. And when they do, they are shot at, they are killed, they are forced to leave again. And people, Palestinians, would return to their homes for a number of reasons. In some cases, they had farms and they were going back to their crops to get what they could to take back with them, or going to their homes to see if indeed they still existed, if they hadn't been dynamited or destroyed by the Zionist forces, to get their property, to get their photo albums, things like this. And so the new state was concerned very strongly with creating, maintaining, perpetuating not only Jewish dominance, but also a demographic majority, making sure that this is a country that has a majority of Jews and that the minority Palestinian population is not able to become a majority, cannot grow to the way that it might sort of naturally through demographic forces and processes. We can see this play out, this notion that because Israel, according to the people who control the government and the state and the ideology, is a Jewish country, has to have a Jewish majority, we have to make sure that the Palestinian minority does not become bigger, does not grow. And so the state does this through various policies to try to limit and reduce the number of Palestinian citizens of the state of Israel and increase the number of Jewish citizens. And I talked a little bit about that last time. Denial of the right of return for Palestinians, for example, who were ethnically cleansed in 1948, and a reciprocal or a simultaneous law of return that allows Jews from anywhere in the world to come to Israel and become citizens almost immediately. And the way that this gets talked about in popular culture amongst the government in Israel, it's widespread, it's long-standing. And here are several more recent examples of this, sort of what I'm calling demographic hysteria. This idea that because we are a country, it is for Jews and not for anyone else, we have to be concerned about the demographics. And so you can see here an example from 2009, 7 existential threats to the state of Israel, written by Michael Oren, who is the former Israeli ambassador to the United States. He himself was, I believe, born in the United States and moved to Israel and became a citizen, so American. He becomes the Israeli ambassador to the United States. He wrote this in Commentary magazine, which is a far-right magazine in the United States. And you can see here very explicitly the way this is talked about. So the Arab demographic threat is a subheading in this article, and it goes on to talk about this very idea. Because we're a Jewish state in Israel, we cannot let Palestinians become a larger part of the population, and if we do, this is an existential threat to the state of Israel. You have a more recent example from 2022 that was published in the Washington Post. And so the point here to understand is that Israel has never been a democracy. A democracy would guarantee equality to all of its citizens. And now, much like the United States, in some ways there is formal equality under some of the laws in Israel for the Palestinian minority. The way they are perceived by society, the way they are treated by other government policies is very much unequal. And it is difficult to imagine a country calling itself being substantively democratic when certain members of that society are talked about, are related to as an existential threat to that society. We can think about in the United States, for example, if there were, and there is sometimes still, though much less commonly, open discussion that African Americans, for example, don't belong here, shouldn't be here, and if they were to become a larger part of the population, it would destroy the United States. Sometimes we hear rhetoric like that, and when we do, it is quite easy to identify it as both racist and anti-democratic. And the same is true in the Israeli case, talking about what is now 20% of the population, Palestinians, as an existential threat to the country is very much anti-democratic, undemocratic. And one final point on this that I will just point out as well, you can see here in Michael Oren's piece, one of the ways in which Israeli culture, government, etc., has tried to erase Palestine and Palestinians from existence totally is in the language that is used as well. So it is very common not to refer to people who are Palestinian, who are now citizens of Israel, but to refer to them as Arabs, Israeli Arabs, the Arabs, and to never use this term Palestinian at all. And in this way, it eliminates, it reduces, tries to incorporate Palestinians into this other kind of group, Arabs, and to diminish the existence and the connection of Palestinians to this territory that is, of course, long-standing. The country is created in 1948, armistice signed with neighboring countries, 1949, and what was the Zionist movement, now the State of Israel, sets about creating, producing state institutions, consolidating its control over territory, ensuring and bolstering its Jewish demographic majority, and doing a number of other things. And we have about a 20-year period from 1948 until 1967 where these processes are taking place. And in 1967, you have another major conflict. And this is very much a really critical set of events to understand when thinking about the history of this region. And so from 1948 until 1967, there is mutual provocation between Israel and the neighboring countries. So provocations by Israel against Egypt and Syria, for example, and also provocations by Egypt against Israel. Border skirmishes, kind of low-level conflict going on in this entire period from 1948 to 1967. But in 1967, Israel launches a surprise attack against these neighboring countries. This is the 1967 war. It's sometimes called the Six-Day War. It is very short, 6 days. And in that time, because it's a surprise attack, because Israel has been bolstering its defense, its military capacities, it is able to very quickly defeat the neighboring countries and to annex and occupy a huge amount of additional territory. And so during this conflict, Israel is able to push its forces through the Sinai Desert and take control of this from Egypt, as well as other territories. Most importantly, for our purposes, East Jerusalem and the West Bank, which had been part of Jordan since 1948, as well as Gaza, which had been occupied by Egypt. In this conflict, another 300,000 Palestinians are displaced, they become refugees, and they go elsewhere. So bringing the total number of Palestinians who are displaced over 1 million, and then of course that population of refugees continues to grow. So 1967 is the beginning of what is called the Israeli occupation. It is a 57-year now illegal military occupation of these territories, of East Jerusalem, of the West Bank, of Gaza, as well as the Golan Heights, which had been territory of Syria, and a very small portion of what had been Lebanon as well. And so this occupation, it's ongoing. Israel does not have a right in perpetuity to maintain a military occupation for nearly 60 years. It is obligated unilaterally to end the occupation. And it has illegally annexed East Jerusalem and basically incorporated it into itself as part of the country, and holds on to the West Bank, has gradually, over the course of the last nearly 60 years, taken more and more of the West Bank, and it has controlled either directly or de facto Gaza since then as well. What has that occupation looked like? We hear this term occupation a lot, and again, it's really important to emphasize it is a military occupation. So the people who live in Gaza, now about 2.2 million, something like this, and several million people in the West Bank, they live under military rule. They have a separate system of military justice and courts that they fall under. There are soldiers patrolling, and this has varied over time, but certainly in 1967, this is how it begins. Israeli military directly in the West Bank, in Gaza, occupying the streets, shooting at people, killing people, censoring the press, denying political freedom, arresting people arbitrarily, deporting people from the territories. So deporting Palestinians, kicking more people out of the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem. As I said, killing people indefinitely, imprisoning people, and torturing people. Israel is infamous, if you like, for torture and has long had policies of torturing Palestinian prisoners. This is not controversial. It is very well documented. And this includes sexual torture. And one of the things to understand, too, is that Israel is the only country in the world that routinely tries children in military courts. And it has arbitrarily detained and arrested children, tortured children in the process of this occupation. So the occupation has been incredibly brutal from beginning until the present day. Several other things, and of course, I will note that I'm going quickly. I am skipping some of the details. There is a lot more detail we could go into, trying to hit just the most important points. But several other things to understand in this period are another series of conflicts. So we have in 1956 a conflict between Israel, France, and the United Kingdom and Egypt. Basically, Egypt nationalizes the Suez Canal, and the British and the French, which are very much still colonial empires at this point, basically collude with Israel to try and take out the government of Egypt and to reverse this. This is greeted very harshly by international reaction, and the United States and the Soviet Union and the United Nations basically tell them they have to stop. There is another war in 1973, often called the Yom Kippur War. This is a surprise attack launched by Egypt against Israel. And Israel wins this conflict as well. The casualties are very high on the Egyptian side, but this has the effect of changing the geopolitics of the region. It puts Egypt in a position to eventually sign a peace treaty with Israel later in the decade. So Egypt is, as I mentioned earlier, one of the few countries in the region that officially does have a peace treaty with Israel. And now one of the other important things to understand, and I'll talk about this in more detail in just a moment, is that there is resistance to the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights, etc., and also more broadly resistance to Israel by Palestinians who have been ethnically cleansed. And so they form, in some cases, guerrilla forces, some of which eventually end up in southern Lebanon. And so Israel fights a series of wars against Lebanon, its northern neighbor. You can see it here on the map. It invades Lebanon in 1978, and then again, kind of a full-scale invasion in 1982, ostensibly to fight against Palestinian guerrillas that are operating from Lebanon. The 1982 invasion of Lebanon by Israel is incredibly violent and brutal. Israel kills something like 19,000 people, mostly civilians, both Lebanese and Palestinians. And Israel allies itself in this conflict with Christian paramilitary forces that are far-right forces modeled on Italian and Spanish fascists quite directly. And Israel basically colludes with these groups with the sort of long-term goal that if they work with the Christians in Lebanon, they can reshape Lebanon into a Christian-dominated country that will be more amenable as an ally to Israel in the region as sort of a bulwark against the other neighboring countries. An infamous episode during the Israeli invasion in 1982 of Lebanon are the Sabra and Shatila massacres. Basically, these Christian paramilitaries, the Phalange, perpetrate this massacre in a Palestinian refugee camp. The figures vary pretty widely in terms of the number of people killed, but likely several thousand Palestinian refugees are massacred by the Lebanese Christian paramilitaries who are working with the Israelis. The Israelis are there surrounding the refugee camp. They are quite literally with goggles looking into the camp as the massacres are happening. And later, some Israeli figures, including Ariel Sharon, who later becomes prime minister, are held responsible for the Israeli role in this massacre. One of the things that also happens as a result of this is Israel occupies southern Lebanon for nearly 20 years. So 1982 it invades, And it occupies, you can see here on the map, sort of in teal, kind of green, this portion of southern Lebanon until the year 2000. And it is in this context that we get the formation of Hezbollah, a group maybe you've heard of, which is a guerrilla organization. It is now part of the government of Lebanon, a paramilitary guerrilla organization that forms in southern Lebanon as a direct result of the Israeli occupation and the Israeli invasion. And they are fighting against primarily Israel, and they have many other sort of their own goals as well, but that's their formation. It is a group, I'll talk about in just a moment, like Hamas, that has a right-wing ideology, that has a guerrilla movement, but has a genuine social base, does things like provide social services, and comes out of the society in southern Lebanon. Now, that brings us to Palestinian resistance. So, starting from 1948, there are efforts by Palestinians to resist the loss of their territory, their homes, their country, and then later the occupation of these additional territories, the military occupation, the brutality of the Israeli regime, etc. And one of the really critical things to understand here is that Palestinians have used any tactic, any strategy you can think of to try to resist Israeli domination. They have used widespread nonviolent protest, for example. They have done things like had general strikes. They have done boycotts. They have worked with international groups to attempt boycotts on Israel. They have gone through and tried to enact diplomatic efforts at the United Nations, bilaterally, multilaterally, and at the United Nations in various ways. And they've engaged in guerrilla warfare. And so the reason why I emphasize this is we hear a lot about the guerrilla warfare, we hear a lot about violent resistance, and it is underemphasized, it is de-emphasized, and indeed it is written out completely in many versions, the fact that Palestinians have also tried nonviolent tactics and have been brutally met with violence often when they have done so. And so when, for example, you hear talking points that say things like, where is the Palestinian Mandela? Where is the Palestinian Gandhi? These sorts of things. Where is the Palestinian MLK? Indeed, there have been many people, many leaders, many movements that have used Gandhian King tactics of passive resistance, nonviolence, etc. And as I said, they have been met largely with incredible violence by the Israeli regime. And so in addition to all of that, they have undertaken guerrilla warfare. And there are a number of different groups who have been involved with this. You can see several here. The PLO, probably most well known and arguably most important, the Palestine Liberation Organization that is founded in the 1960s. It has many different factions. It's quite complex, but you can see one of them here, the PFLP, which is sort of a left-wing Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, one of the factions within the PLO. And I want to emphasize as well that occupied people, colonized people, have a well-established right to resist. This is something that is taken for granted in many other conflicts. In Algeria, for example, the Algerians had a right to resist French colonial occupation and domination, and indeed they did. In Vietnam, the Vietnamese had a right to resist French colonial occupation and later American occupation and violence. These are well established not only in international law, but as a basic sort of moral and ethical principle. No one likes to be dominated. We have in the American ethos this idea that we were being unfairly treated by the British, and we therefore had a right to violently resist British colonial domination. And indeed, that's what happened. And so this is a general principle. It applies to all people. All people have a right to freedom. All people have a right not to be dominated by other groups of people. And so that doesn't mean we have to accept every tactic, every strategy used. To explain is not to justify why people do what they do. But it is critically and crucially important to understand this, that Palestinians, like all people, have a right to resist, and they have a right to resist by any means necessary. We may be uncomfortable with that. We may not like that. However, unless you are an absolute pacifist and you think no violence is ever acceptable, most people are not absolute pacifists. Indeed, very, very few are. My own work is in the pacifist tradition, but I don't consider myself an absolute pacifist. And so unless you are an absolute pacifist, you are then implicitly or explicitly justifying some kinds of violence. So it is not a question of whether violence per se is acceptable, but which violence, whose violence is acceptable. And the default, the implicit idea is that Israel, the United States, the so-called good guys in the world, their violence is good because they are good. That's the assumption. They are allowed to use any amount, any level of violence that they want to pursue their goals. However, those who resist with violence are considered evil in some versions, terrorists, etc., etc. And so this is complex. It may be uncomfortable, but it is really important to understand and to be thinking seriously about. With that established, these groups were active from the 1960s onward, based at various points in Jordan, in North Africa, in Lebanon, etc. And they continue to be active, of course, until this day. This leads us to another major point in this history to understand. So we have the occupation that starts in 1967. You have the formation of nonviolent resistance, of guerrilla resistance, and you have had now, by 1987, 20 years of military occupation, brutal occupation, torture, violence, etc. And so in 1987, this boils up, and it boils up into a largely unarmed and nonviolent mass uprising, what we call now, in retrospect, the First Intifada, an uprising that happens in the occupied territories by Palestinians, largely nonviolent, organized, I will note as well, in many cases by women and in civil society. And this uprising is met with a brutal crackdown. Israeli military goes in, police, other security forces, and they shoot and they injure and they kill many Palestinians. So across this uprising that lasts for about 6 years, something like 1,500 Palestinians are killed. Compare this with about 165 Israelis who are killed in this time period. And something like 120,000 Palestinians are injured. So mass injuries with live ammunition, with so-called rubber bullets, tear gas, the whole gamut of repressive state forces. Israel also undertakes collective punishment, so closing down of rights of movement, mass arrests, these sorts of things. And one of the tactics that the Israeli government has used, that it has become infamous for over the course of the occupation, is something called home demolition. And so in Israel, they use a tactic where if someone is accused, not convicted necessarily, but accused of violence against state forces, terrorist activity, a number of different kinds of crimes. If a Palestinian is accused of these crimes, of let's say planting a bomb somewhere, Israel will often go in and demolish their home, demolish the homes of their families, and kick out their families from their land. This is very clearly collective punishment. This is considered a crime under international law. And again, under basic kind of moral standards, we don't punish other people for the activities of their family members. Nevertheless, this is a very common tactic used by Israel across what we call the conflict. You can see some pictures here from the First Intifada. The one at the top is quite famous. And what it does really is illustrate the power imbalance between these two groups of people. You have a young Palestinian boy, he's holding a rock. This sort of becomes a symbol of Palestinian resistance. And he's holding a rock and he's facing down an Israeli tank. And so Palestinians, a population, a people who have been forcibly disarmed, have no military, have no way of defending themselves from the violence of the Israeli regime. They don't have tanks. They don't have jet fighters or air defenses or anything like this. So they have used any tactics that they can against the extreme violence of a nuclear armed state in the form of Israel. Now finally then, one may be wondering, where is Hamas in all of this? So we started this history in the 1880s, and more than 100 years go by before Hamas is founded. Hamas is only founded in 1987. Indeed, it is younger than I am. And it is formed in the context, it grows out of the context of the Intifada, of this uprising, and the violent Israeli crackdown. So Hamas, as I mentioned before, like Hezbollah, is an organization that forms, it has a genuine social base in Palestinian society. That doesn't mean every Palestinian supports it, but it has a social base, meaning it has a certain level of buy-in. It comes out of Palestinian society, and it does a number of different things. It's a complex organization, like all organizations. It is often reduced simply to its armed wing, but it is not simply its armed wing. One of the ways in which it is formed and kind of grows out of Palestinian society and also garners support within Palestinian society is the provision of things like social services and charity. So providing people who have been living under occupation with the things that they need to live, food and so forth. And so it's doing this. It has a political wing. Of course, later on, as I'll talk about in just a moment, it becomes elected and it becomes the government in Gaza. And it also has an armed wing. And so it is a direct result of the Israeli occupation. It didn't exist before the occupation, and it only comes about because of the violence of the Israeli occupation. And some sense amongst some members of Palestinian society that we have tried nonviolent means, we have tried to resist occupation by various means, and we have been unsuccessful. And so this comes about in that context. We have the Intifada. It starts in 1987. It lasts until about 1993. You have the rise of Hamas, and you have a change in some ways in the balance of forces within sort of Palestinian society and the liberation movement. And you also have what is often called the peace process. So you have the Oslo peace process, named because negotiations start in Oslo. And this is, since the beginning, since 1948, the first sort of serious or sustained effort to have a political, a diplomatic solution to the occupation and to what is called the conflict. From the Oslo process comes this idea of a two-state solution. So the idea that the way to resolve this, the way to end violence, is for there to be two countries. Again, we come back to partition. So the idea is there will be Israel, and there will be eventually, not right away, and this is critical, a Palestinian state alongside it. And under Oslo, many of the final details of this are left ambiguous, are not worked out, but an agreement is come to. The ostensible leaders of the two groups, the Israelis and the Palestinians, agree. In principle, we will move forward with this process whereby Israel will end the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, and these territories and some others, but undefined, will become a Palestinian state. You can see here a famous photo, Bill Clinton on the White House lawn with Yitzhak Rabin, the Israeli Prime Minister, and Yasser Arafat, the representative of the Palestine Liberation Organization. And you can look here at this map. This is one of the things that comes out of Oslo, is looking at the territories. Here's the West Bank, and breaking it into various areas, A, B, and C. And the idea that, as I said, Oslo will not overnight create a Palestinian state, but eventually there will be one. And this will happen in phases. And so different parts of the territory will be given full sovereignty as a Palestinian state at various times. There will be a small area, Area 1, that will pretty soon be under Palestinian control. Some of it will be controlled jointly. And then Israel will, even under this peace agreement for the short term, remain in control of most of the West Bank. And this is a critical thing to understand. The idea that Oslo did not demand immediate recognition of a Palestinian state alongside an Israeli one, but eventually, in the future, at some point, there will be a Palestinian state. Its borders have not been fully defined, and the details have not fully been worked out, including, critically, what will happen with the Palestinian refugees. Oslo happens 1993, there's a second agreement in 95, and there is some movement toward creating the proto-institutions that are meant to become the government of Palestine. But this doesn't happen immediately, and by 2000, there is growing frustration amongst segments of Palestinian society that things are not moving forward, that there is feet dragging by the Israelis, and there are actions by the Israelis that are making final negotiations very difficult, if not impossible. A major component of this, which I'll talk more about in a moment, are continued settlement into the West Bank in particular, sending of Israeli settlers to take more territory in the territory that is earmarked for a Palestinian state. So because of all of this, and because of provocations by the Israeli government, a second uprising starts in 2000. It's sometimes called the Al-Aqsa Intifada for its location starting in Jerusalem. And this time, it is much more violent. This time, and this is really where we get, it starts in the 1990s, but this is really where we get this idea of the suicide bomber in the conflict in Palestine and Israel. Now, suicide bombing was not developed first in this context. My understanding is that it's first used by the Tamil Tigers in that conflict, but nevertheless, it is taken up as a tactic of conflict by primarily Hamas and other groups like Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And so the use of suicide bombing, the use of attacks like this against Israelis and against Israeli military targets, but also against Israeli civilians. Nevertheless, far more Palestinians are killed than Israelis. There is another very brutal crackdown against Palestinians, against this uprising. Something like 3,000 Palestinians are killed. And this time, as I said, something like 1,000 Israelis are killed. So much more violence, many more casualties on the Israeli side, and a shift, if you like, in tactics and in the way that this conflict is being fought. Oslo happens. There is an idea that we will, again, we come back to this idea of partition. We will partition the land. There will be two countries. There will be a Palestine and there will be an Israel. But one of the major stumbling blocks to this, and this is something that started from 1967 onward, and that is Israeli settlement in the West Bank and in Gaza. And so after Israel takes control of the West Bank and Gaza in 1967, it starts to send Israelis and also Jews from abroad who come and become Israelis and then move to the West Bank, to Gaza. They set up towns, they set up military outposts, they build homes in an effort to create what's called facts on the ground. So the idea is, you can see on the map here, you have the West Bank. It is earmarked for a Palestinian state eventually. However, you can see in the blue dots, all throughout this territory are Israeli settlements. The larger the dot, the more people who live there. Thousands and later tens of thousands, later hundreds of thousands of Israelis leave Israel proper and they go to occupied Palestinian territory in order to make it difficult for this territory to ever be turned over to an eventual Palestinian state. That, as you can imagine, if you think about the realities of this, that if you have a territory that is Swiss cheesed by a foreign population, by an armed military population, what happens to them eventually? Are they kicked out of the West Bank? Do they get to keep their settlements? Will they be willing to leave, etc.? Now, in 2024, there's something like 700,000 Israeli settlers in the West Bank, something like 10% of the total Israeli population. And again, they live all throughout this territory. And you can see here, interestingly on this map, the way that it's named. So I come back to this idea I mentioned earlier about not using the word Palestinian, of calling Palestinians Arabs to delegitimize, to dehistoricize, and so forth. And one of the other, just to briefly mention, ways that the Israeli government and the sort of ideology of the state has perpetuated itself is by claiming history to the ancient past, claiming we are the direct inheritors of the ancient Israelite kingdoms, and so forth. And so, very commonly in Israeli discourse, the West Bank is called Judea and Samaria, using the biblical names for this territory, using the names of these ancient Israelite kingdoms in an effort to say, well, this territory has always belonged to us. It has always been Jewish in a way, Israeli in a way. It's an anachronistic, projecting back into the past. And therefore, Palestinians have no right to it. This is our territory. We have a right to settle it. Some of the settlers, many of them, are religious fanatics. They have an extremist view of Judaism that says, this land belongs to us because God gave it to us. We therefore have a right to take it. Some of them are secular, but they still believe this land belongs to us. Palestinians have no right to it. We're going to continue to take it. And so again, as you can imagine, this becomes a major stumbling block to peace. It is one of the reasons why Oslo has not gone forward, has fizzled out in the 25 years, 30 years since it was initially signed, and continues to be a major problem in, again, what we call the conflict. Now, there were also settlers in Gaza until 2005, but in 2005, the Israeli government unilaterally withdrew its settlers from Gaza while retaining de facto occupation of Gaza. And that's important to understand as well. We have Oslo. We have ostensibly this process moving toward creating a separate and sovereign Palestinian state. We have this second uprising that happens in the year 2000. And we have the ramping up of settlement in the occupied territories and the increasing difficulty of actually enacting in practice, in reality, that separate Palestinian state. And then in 2006, we have what are supposed to be the second in ongoing elections for who will govern the new Palestinian state, who will be elected leaders for a period of time until there are new elections. There's elections held in 1996 and then again in 2006. These are the infamous elections where Hamas wins. And so one hears that Hamas won election in 2006, and this is true. There were elections for the Palestinian Legislative Council, again, which was meant to become the parliament for the new Palestinian state. Now, what's important to understand here, and you can see here on this chart, is that Hamas wins a plurality. They don't win an outright majority, and they do not run away with it. They win a few percentage points more of the total vote than the second most vote getter, Fatah, which is the major faction, one of the major factions in the kind of old PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization, influential in the liberation movement since the 1960s. They win about 41% of the vote, and Hamas wins about 44% of the vote. So not a huge difference there. And then you have some of the other groups that won a smaller percentage, PFLP that I mentioned, etc. So Hamas wins. It is, by all accounts, a free and fair election. There are international election monitors, and everyone says, yes, this was a legitimate election. And so the idea is, this is a parliamentary election. It's a parliamentary system. Hamas, as the largest vote getter and the largest number of seats, will form a government in a parliamentary system. However, what happens is that the United States and Israel and others are not happy about this. They did not anticipate that Hamas would win a plurality of the vote. They did not anticipate Hamas being able to form a government, and they are not happy about this. And so what the Israelis do is they immediately move to blockade Gaza. And what the Americans do is basically cook up a scheme to prevent Hamas from becoming the government, to prevent them from taking power peacefully in this democratic election. And so essentially what they do is they work with some sort of Palestinian factions in the West Bank, provide them with funding in an effort to preempt Hamas from taking power, basically to foment a coup against an incoming Hamas government. Hamas gets wind of this and preemptively basically takes up arms against this faction, and there is an internecine conflict between factions of the Palestinian kind of organizations and liberation movement. And what this does is it leaves the government fractured. What was meant to be the government of all of the Palestinian territories now leaves Hamas isolated and in control, governing Gaza, and Fatah in control in the West Bank. And now this remains to the present day. There have been many efforts over the last nearly 20 years to reconcile, to create a unity government, and so forth, but it hasn't happened yet. Again, Israel moves to blockade Gaza, to isolate Gaza, to punish Gaza and the people of Gaza for the temerity of voting in a free and fair democratic election. And Israel didn't like the outcome and therefore tried to prevent it from happening. So the elections happen. Hamas wins a plurality. Israel, the United States, don't like the outcome, try to prevent them from taking power. to coming to power democratically. This leaves Gaza isolated, under blockade, and Hamas in control as the government de facto of Gaza from 2006 until the present. And as I said, one of Israel's first acts and ongoing acts is to blockade Gaza, to make it so that people can't get out, goods can't get in. You can see here on the map what this looks like kind of in a geographic sense. Not only are people trapped in Gaza, it becomes very difficult to get out, but Israel takes control of the border. It takes control of an area inside Gaza. It calls it a security zone or something like this. And basically, it arrogates to itself the right to shoot at, to kill anyone who enters this zone inside the Gaza border. So Israel is de facto controlling not just the border externally, but in the Gaza Strip as well. And it's also controlling the sea. So you can see here there is a limit to which Palestinian fishermen, for example, can go out into the Mediterranean and fish. And we have many, many examples of this. You can find video of this online, of Palestinian fishermen going out, doing their jobs, trying to bring in food for income for their families, being shot at, being killed by the Israeli Navy because they have gone outside of this arbitrary zone that Israel has imposed upon Gaza. And so Israel prevents goods from coming in, food, medicine, essential goods for the people who live there. This has created an incredible amount of poverty in Gaza and hardship for the people of Gaza. You can see here, this is kind of an infamous quote from 2012 from an advisor to one of the former Israeli prime ministers, Ehud Olmert, who said kind of notoriously, the idea is to put the Palestinians on a diet, but not to make them die of hunger. So information had come out that Israel was very carefully tracking what are the minimum number of calories every Palestinian who lives in Gaza needs in order to live. Not to thrive, not to die, but to live. And so you see this very intentional Israeli government process and project to control the very lives and bodies of Palestinians who live in Gaza, to make their lives as miserable as possible so that they will rise up and overthrow Hamas in some versions. You can find kind of quotes of Israeli government officials saying things to this effect. Gaza remains under blockade from 2006 to the present. Not only has the blockade caused an incredible amount of misery, suffering, malnutrition, lack of medical care, lack of educational and work opportunities, disease, and so forth, but in this period, from 2006 onward, and this actually leaves off 2006, but there's also a military assault in 2006, Israel has repeatedly been bombing and attacking Gaza. In 2008, in 2012, 2014, 2021, and now, of course, 2024. And so periodically, during each of these assaults, Israel uses its advanced, powerful modern military, primarily air-powered jet fighters, to bomb and to target Palestinians, to destroy homes, to destroy buildings, and to kill thousands of people in Gaza. And we can see from 2008, which is sort of considered the first of the most major of these, it's called Operation Cast Lead, but again, there was a military campaign in Gaza by Israel in 2006. I was actually in Jerusalem when that happened. It was also when another Israeli invasion of Lebanon happened as well. So 2006, and then in 2008 to the present, almost 7,000 Palestinians, excuse me, not the present, 2008 to October 6th of last year, the day before the October 7th attack. Almost 7,000 Palestinians were killed in Gaza, and almost 160,000 were injured. Now, if we compare that to the casualties on the Israeli side, 319 Israelis were killed and about 6,500 injured. Now, I think it's really important to understand it's always a tragedy when people are killed. It is horrible, especially when civilians, when children, when people who are non-combatants are killed. But I want to make crystal clear that we can look at this and we can understand this is not a conflict between two parties. It is a colonial situation wherein one group of people has taken a territory by force, is holding millions of people under military occupation, and is routinely subjecting them to violence. And so Palestinians, since the 1880s, certainly since 1948, 1967, have been reacting to Israeli violence. And you can see the violence is extreme. There is no balance in the number of casualties. There is no balance in what this looks like in practice. And so I want to end there for today. I will pick up a third set of slides on the events from October 7th until the present. Thank you.